This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 13. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 13, The Republic of Mahabad. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 12 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. That is Yazdani Law Group. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 13. Well, for a brief period after the Second World War, less than a year in fact, the world witnessed the formation of a Kurdish republic. Indeed, it was a self-governing Kurdish state that covered territory that before and thereafter constituted much of the northwestern part of Iran. It was founded in January of 1946 and would represent something of a pinnacle of unified power for the Kurds of the region and the crescendo of a Kurdish nationalist movement in Iran that had been building momentum in the first half of the 20th century. The short-lived state was called the Republic of Mahabad. So, what spawned this movement of Iranian Kurds searching for nationhood and unity dating back to the constitutional revolution of 1905? And how did Kurdish nationalism grow in such strength and ideology to reach its zenith with an independent, albeit brief, republic to realize the dream of autonomy and self-government for the Kurdish people of Iran? And what would become of the Kurdish unity and power embodied in the Republic of Mahabad after it collapsed by the end of 1946? Well, to discuss this pivotal movement in the contemporary history of Iran and an essential event in the story of Kurdish people of the modern era, I'm joined by an expert on this very subject. Dr. Abbas Vali is a Kurdish political and social theorist specializing in modern and contemporary political thought and modern Middle Eastern politics. He was born in Mahabad in 1949, did his schooling in Tabriz and Tehran, and would get his PhD at the University of London. His books include Pre-Capitalist Iran, A Theoretical History, Modernity and the Stateless, The Kurdish Question in Iran, and Kurds and the State in Iran, The Making of Kurdish Identity. Since 2008, Professor Vali has been teaching modern social and political theory in the Department of Sociology at Bospherous University in Istanbul. He has a new book coming out next year called Reconstituting the Kurdish Question, Power and Resistance in the Contemporary Kurdistan. But first, right now, Dr. Abbas Vali joins me from Istanbul, Turkey today. Hello, sir.
Hello to you. Hello.
It's very good to have you on the program. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
You know, just before we begin, I have to say, perhaps you'll find it interesting or perhaps telling that in preparation for this interview, as I've been telling some of the people on the team and some friends of mine of Iranian background here in this city about doing an episode on the Republic of Mahabad, it surprised me that these learned people, for the most part, had never heard of it. This is a state that existed in the 20th century within the country of Iran, and yet a lot of Iranians don't know a lot about it. Does that surprise you?
No, because Iranian historiography and Iranian academia in general is very Persian-centered. Iran is identified with the Persian-speaking parts centered on Tehran, and the other parts of Iran usually, in a sense, subsumed under this general rubric of Iran, but they remain voiceless, so to speak. So if you tell an average Iranian that there was a Republic of Kurdistan and also Republic of Azerbaijan, then they will be surprised, because in the official historiography, and for that matter, in much of the academic historiography, these parts either do not receive any attention or mention, or if they receive attention and mention, it is only, passing. So this is really not surprising at all.
Is it an issue of omission or of commission? In other words, do you believe that there's been an active attempt to suppress this kind of history, given that obviously successive governments or regimes would have no interest in Iran in celebrating this the short-lived state of this Republic of Kurdistan?
On the part of the official historiography, it is definitely actively, this kind of line pursued to not only marginalize, but totally exclude, what is non-Persian from the definition of Iranian identity. That is what Iranian identity stands for. It is Persian ethnicity, Persian language, Shi'i religion. If you look at the Constitution of 1906, and also Constitution of 1979 of Islamic Republic, you will find the definition of Iranian identity exactly in a way that I just mentioned.
We will get to that.
Yes.
And it is all the more interesting, I might say, given that the Kurdish population is a pretty significant one still in Iran. I was trying to get the stats. I mean, the closest I could come is to find that Kurdish people today constitute about 10% of the population of Iran. That would make them the third largest ethnic group after Persians and Azerbaijanis. Is that right? I mean, it's true that we don't really have exact statistics on this because the current government of Iran kind of tries to underestimate the exact size and influence of the Kurds, right?
All governments have done, the royalist government as well, that when censuses have been carried out, the first one, as I recall, it was 1335, which would be 1956. It was carried out, and after that, regularly censuses in Iran have been carried out, but these censuses, in the census, do not register ethnicity of the population. So we actually do not know what exact population of the Azeris, Baluchis, the Kurds, the Turkmens are in Iran. They're all lumped under this general term of Iranian, so to speak. But religion is registered, but ethnicity and language is not registered. And the same goes in the Islamic Republic. Therefore, the actual size of the Kurdish population is always contested. If you talk to a Kurdish nationalist, would put it at sort of 16 million, even more. If you talk to a government official, would say 6 million, or perhaps would say 6 to 7, 8 at most. But let's say, I mean, for scholars who are, if you like, claiming to be objective, it is about 12 million Kurds in Iran, definitely, yes.
You know, as we get into this discussion of Kurdish nationalism and nationalism in general, as someone who, you know, for those of us who grew up in the late 20th century, early 21st century, you don't, it's hard to imagine a world where nationalism doesn't exist. But you've written that Kurdish national identity in Iran is a fundamentally modern occurrence. So I want to talk about Kurdish nationalism and how it grew in that first half of the 20th century. But before we get to that, and if you can do this briefly, what was Kurdish identity for centuries before the idea of national identity?
Well, it is like Persian community, like Azeri community. They were ethnic linguistic, at time linguistic. For instance, depending on what exactly it is facing, because identity is always in relationship to differences which is facing it, and it's how it defines it. If and when the community next to it was giving, in terms of its identity, giving prominence to ethnicity in the Kurdish community, ethnicity became prominent and became the dominant factor in the expression of that identity. The other of Kurds have changed. And according to this change, the constituent elements of Kurdish identity have also changed. Therefore, when they have faced the other in terms of the official Persian identity, you see that in Iran as well, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and up to present, the definition of Kurdish or conception of Kurdish identity is prominently defined in terms of its ethnicity and language.
Right.
But in the Islamic Republic, because of the emphasis on Shia religion, we see that Kurds as well tend to emphasize their Sunni religion.
Yes.
This is, however, not to say that Kurdistan is completely and entirely a Sunni community. No, there are Shi'i Kurds there are heterodox Shi'i Kurds there, and there are non-Muslim Kurds like Yazidis. But predominantly, I would say the majority of the Kurds in Iran are followers of Sunni religion. Yes.
Okay, let's get into the historical meat of this. Take us back to the late 19th century in the Qajar era of Iran. There is a body of opinion, as you know, that traces the roots of Iranian Kurdish nationalism back specifically to the rebellion of Sheikh Ubaydullah, first against the Ottoman Empire, then against the Persians. What was this about, and how did it cement Mahabad and places like Urmia and Tabriz as future homes of what would become that brief Kurdish Republic by 1946?
Sheikh Ubaydullah was a Kurdish dignitary in the Ottoman Empire, and it fell out with the Ottomans over the question of rule and over the question of political centralization, because as the Ottomans started political centralization, that means that Ottoman power encroached upon the autonomy of Kurdish principalities and Kurdish, if you like, the power of the Kurdish sheikhs and so on and so forth. And the conflict started from there. Sheikh Ubaydullah's conflict was fundamentally a conflict between the Kurdish region and the central government. But this conflict has been interpreted in different ways. Some who think that it was the beginning of Kurdish nationalism refer to a letter that Sheikh wrote to the British Council in Van, saying that the Kurds are a different nation, they speak different language, and they have a different religion. Therefore, they deserve to be a nation and should be treated so. But the point is that the rebellion of Sheikh against the center expanded very quickly. And then because of confrontation with the Ottomans, it spilled over and went over to the Iranian Kurdistan and engulfed quite a large sector of Iranian Kurdistan, especially in the northern and northwestern regions. It was in 1881 to the 82, 83 that rebellion was put down. And this is often considered as the beginning of Kurdish nationalism in Iran. But the point that is made that if for those who think that nationalism is modern and is constructed in confrontation with the Persian other, with the Persian definition of Iranian political power and political identity, those think that this may be considered, Sheikh's movement may be considered as a precursor.
Right.
Or
it was whetting the appetite, perhaps.
That should be. Yes. But it had a great impact. It had a great impact. Yes.
I mean, it's a good segue, because I was going to say that the late 19th century and early 20th century, as I understand it, is this period of great tumult in Iran as the country is gradually integrating its pre-capitalist economy into the capitalist world market, and the structure of the Qajar autocracy is crumbling. So with this constitutional revolution of 1905 and 1906, autocratic rule, in official terms, I guess at least, is replaced by a constitutional monarchy. This is where many usually mark the birth of Iranian nationalism. How did Iranian nationalism thereby spawn Kurdish nationalism? Is it as simple as a reaction?
Well, everything that I said about the origins of Kurdish nationalism also applies to the origins of Iranian nationalism. I mean, there are people who think that Iranian nationalism is 2,500, 600 years old,
right,
and goes back to the beginning of the Iranian state by the Achaemenids.
Right.
But there are also people who think that, no, that is not the case. And Iranian nationalism and Iranian national identity are pretty modern phenomenon, and they started with the constitutional movement, when for the first time the concept of Iranian nation entered political discourse. So these two are interlinked, and in that way, the rise of Kurdish nationalism and Turkish Azeri nationalism, in my opinion, and those who think that nationalism is a fundamentally political modern phenomenon everywhere in the world, for us, this was the constitutional revolution is the beginning. It's the landmark. It's the beginning of all these new movements and identities in the country which is called Iran.
For the sake of this interview, we'll hereby, from now on, assume we're talking about modern nationalism. I think you've issued enough disclaimers about that there's differences in that. Why did the Kurdish leadership in Iran participate in counter-revolutionary politics in this constitutional era? More simply put, why did the Kurds oppose the establishment of a constitutional republic of Iran? How did they know that this would not be good for them?
There are some who say that at that time there were also development associations and so on in Kurdistan, and may well be so, but I don't know if it is documented in that respect. But generally speaking, I think the reason why Kurdistan remained, if you like, outside this constitutional orbit, so to speak, was, I think, in the first instance, was the isolation of Kurdistan economically and politically, and also its very, entrenched, let's say, pre-capitalist political, social structure and cultural formations. Constitutional revolution largely was center-based, and that's just Tehran-based. And Tabriz also played a very important role with it. And then Shiraz, Isfahan, and so on joined in, largely because that they were already part of the political and economic structures of existing Qajar system there. But the Kurds were not. They had a very strong tribal structure and had been kept largely isolated. And up to the middle of 1880s, the large part of Kurdistan was run by Kurdish principalities who were the tributary payers to the central government. And central government, in a sense, received taxes and tributes, and the Kurds of Ardalan and the other parts in Mukrian and others, they run their own affairs.
Well, what I was going to say, actually, when you talk about the pre-capitalist order and the feudal or agrarian or whatever we want to call it order, it seems to me, and this is undoubtedly an oversimplification, but I mean, if we can simplify it, is it fair to say that for many years, perhaps for centuries before the end of this Qajar era, that there was some kind of balanced ecosystem by which the Kurdish populations of Iran operated in this agrarian pre-capitalist form and kept to themselves, and there was an order that was disrupted by the coming of capitalism and the Ottoman Empire, etc. Is that a simple way of putting it?
That is true. That is true. In fact, for quite some time, the major cultural influence was Ottoman Empire rather than Iran, in terms of, particularly 19th century. Yes, that is true. I mean, Kurdistan was mainly because of the rule of these principalities and because of the disinterest from Tehran, so to speak, in that way. Kurdistan was basically not part of the central, if you like, circle of rule, while, for instance, Azerbaijan was not the same. I mean, the Qajars were basically the Azeri Turks. The major part of the political structure and elite in Tehran were from Azerbaijan. The Qajar crown princes who resided in Tabriz before they became king. And all that meant that Tabriz, Shiraz, Isfahan, and so on, they were integral part of this definition of what was called the center. But places like Kurdistan or Baluchistan, and to some extent even Luristan, they were, in the peripheries of this central, if you like, field of power. Therefore, they were not comparable to the Kurds who were always in the margin.
There's elements of this Constitution of 1905, 1906 that I have a lot of trouble understanding. I mean, it may just be my own simple misreadings of things, but I hope sometime before I die I'll understand this Constitution. but did the Constitution of 1905 not allow for Kurdish autonomous rule within the boundaries of a sovereign state of Iran? So, in other words, why would the Kurds be worried about that if that was carved out in the Constitution?
No, it was not. You see, in the Constitution, no autonomous region, whether it is Kurdistan or Azerbaijan or anywhere else, were recognized. Iran was considered as a unified state run from the center with a unified identity, which was Persian community. But this is not. But beside the point, what was it that in the Constitution? It was, however, recognized that there are provincial and local differences in language and ethnicity. So they came and introduced the idea of what was called Anjumanhay Iyalati wa Vilayati, which is the provincial and local councils, and they should be created according to the Constitution. They should be established and given the power to act in their own parts. But this power was all the more everywhere. It was defined as administrative power. They were never given political power. In other words, modern Iranian state has been always a centralized state, and has been whoever has been in charge, whether they were royals, monarchy, or now the Islamic Republic and the religious theocracy. This issue of ethnic and linguistic identities, what I call them the non-sovereign ethnic and linguistic identities, they are not recognized and they're not allowed to have their political rights and cultural rights, so to speak.
Okay, let me ask you about the what seems to be the greatest precipitant of the rise of Kurdish nationalism, based on what I've read and based on what you've written. And that is what you've talked about a couple of times already in this interview, the centralization of identity, or the attempt at unifying identity in Iran, or what might also be called the Persianization campaign that begins with the Constitution and obviously finds its momentum as well under Reza Shah. The Constitution of 1905, 1906 specifies that Persian should become the official language of the nation, and the language of administration and the language of education. What is the effect that this has on Kurdish sentiment?
When you say that the official language, it means that any other language is non-official. Right. And but there are situations in which, in a democratic society or democratic state, these non-official languages are provided for, and they're recognized and respected, and their rights which originate from this recognition are accepted, and they are enforced. But in a country like Iran and Turkey, this is not the case. They recognize that there is a Kurdish language, but they consider that it is to be as a local spoken language.
So the net effect of this Constitution of 1905 is we've written an official document, and by the way, we're now excluding you, or you have to melt into our into Persian identity. Is that basically?
This is always, yes, that is it. If you want to, the idea is that they say this is the definition of national identity. So if you want to be an Iranian, then you will have to relinquish yours and accept this definition of national identity, and yours will become marginal local, and a state, which is, of course, by this, when you say that it is marginal local, it is unofficial. And when the opposition comes from a place like Kurdistan or in Balochistan or in Azerbaijan, then with this opposition comes, it means that this non-official language, non-official identity becomes directly linked to the security of the state. So expressions of Kurdish identity is a matter of security in Iran. When you have this official identity, this official language and so on, then every other person which doesn't conform with those specifics but are living in Iran, they are practically second-class, second-rate citizens, so to speak, if they are citizens.
And by the way, ethnicity was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but the nationalization of language and education effectively served to exclude those of different ethnicities. Would that be correct?
It doesn't matter whether it is mentioned or not. All the cultural institutions, all the cultural practices in Iran are conducted in terms of this ethnicity. They will say usually you are Iranian first, and then you are Kurdish or Azeri second. You say, okay, I am even happy to accept that, but will you respect my rights as a Kurd? And can I have my own administration in my part of Iran? Or can Azeris have their own administration? They said, no, that goes against the security of the state. The state is uniform bloc. It is a uniform political bloc, and it is ruled and run from the center by an elite who profess this identity and support it and defend it.
Right. So as I understand it, there's these there's these lightning rods. I mean, even if we don't go back to the rebellion of the Sheikh, starting with the Constitution in 1905, there's these lightning points that push forward, that put the wind in the sails of Kurdish nationalism. Another one is World War One, which Iran gets unwittingly or perhaps unwillingly drawn into. And the battlefield, it largely takes place in Kurdistan. How does that affect Kurdish sentiment and create another lightning rod for Kurdish agitation in Iran?
First World War, just as you rightly said, when Kurdistan became battlefield of contending forces, it had absolutely devastating effect on Kurdistan in terms of death, famine, starvation, and destruction. Therefore, it was, in a sense, largely put back the community and society in economic terms. There is no doubt about it. It also seemed to have, in a very different way, reinforced the nascent movement of nationalism in Kurdistan, the awareness of the difference, the awareness of the incapability of the center to defend its parts, the awareness that the Persian state is fundamentally concerned with keeping the center, right, and keeping that identity clearly in a decade or so reflected on the relationship between Kurdistan and the center. But what gave a material foundation to this Kurdish feeling of difference was these authoritarian modernizations that Reza Shah carried out in Iran. Reza Shah created or laid the foundation of a modern state, and this required, from his point of view, and the political and cultural elite which were working with him, that local languages, identities, and languages didn't matter. Uniform administration, uniform taxation, uniform education, but they were all in Persian and in aid of the uniform Persian identity.
Is this what you mean by Pahlavi absolutism?
That is right, yes.
And
yes.
So Pahlavi absolutism inspires another wave of growth of Kurdish nationalism. The Reza Shah regime seems to see a potential threat of Kurdish nationalism, and there's a moment I want to ask you about with Foroughi, the Iranian ambassador to Turkey. This is in 1927, proposing measures for a joint Iranian-Turkish cooperation against Kurdish movements. What would Reza Shah have been most concerned about?
Well, you see, Reza Shah was seriously attracted to developments in Turkey under Ataturk. And Ataturk created this uniform nation by blood and sweat, destruction, murder, and mayhem. And Reza Shah didn't go that way. But in a sense, Reza Shah wanted this uniform state to be established. And this is why that, when he was in power in 1930s, Kurds basically were subdued, and they were probably waiting for the opportune time to come. And the opportune time came when Reza Shah abdicated and was removed from Iran. And then Kurdish nationalism was thrown into the center of Kurdish politics and then subsequently Iranian politics. This is why Reza Shah was removed in 1941, barely a year after that. The first nationalist organization, which was called the Association or Society for the Revival of Kurdistan, was formed in Mahabad. And that association, in a sense, spread and developed very rapidly. But then after 3 years, in 1945, it was replaced by the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, or the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, which is still in existence and is still the standard, one of the bearer of Kurdish opposition to the Islamic State.
Yes. Before I get to the KDPI and in fact the formation of the Republic of Mahabad, I want to quote something you said, just talking about the Pahlavi regime and Pahlavi absolutism. I want to actually quote something from one of your books where you say, "The conception of nation and national identity as uniform and indivisible constructed by the Pahlavi state thus denied ethnic difference and cultural pluralism, and the ethnic difference accordingly became the strategic target of the discourse of national identity." So, Dr. Vali, are you saying that after years of coexistence, in one way or another, it was now the de facto policy of the Iranian state that Kurds expressing pride or dominion over their own culture and ethnicity was seen as somehow treacherous?
Yes, of course. I mean, this all goes back to the creation of this, the establishment of this so-called nation state, Iranian nation state, just as it was the case in the Ottoman Empire. When there was not a state which claimed ethnic and linguistic identity, then there was no problem between the Kurds and Turks in the Ottomans, and in Iran, between the Kurds and the Persians and Azeris, because the state didn't have that identity. So these people, in a sense, did not see their own identities in danger. They didn't see it as being attacked, excluded, and in certain places like Turkey, actually eliminated. So this is all the product of modern state, particularly the nation state, where political power has an identity, and we have the idea, we see that all those who do not conform with this identity are automatically excluded from the domain of legitimate politics, legitimate cultural activity, and become targets of state violence if they resist and do not accept that identity.
All of this has an impact on the Kurdish Iranians, who throughout this entire period are the sentiment around Kurdish nationalism is growing, and it reaches, as I said in the introduction, its zenith with this creation of the Republic of Mahabad. I mean, it is extraordinary to think, especially given the backdrop of what you've just talked about and Pahlavi absolutism and all of that, that an independent state, albeit a short-lived, as we've said repeatedly, could spring up in Iran in 1946. You mentioned the KDPI, the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran. How was the Republic of Mahabad actually formed in January of 1946?
First, I would say that, it was actually Republic of Kurdistan, not Mahabad. If you read their writings, their newspapers, they considered themselves as the Republic of Kurdistan. It became known as Republic of Mahabad because it was centered on Mahabad, and also because the first book written by Eagleton, William Eagleton, the book is entitled Republic of Mahabad. And subsequently, Roosevelt also writes the same thing, an article about Republic of Mahabad. So this is actually Republic of Kurdistan. But having come to that is that clearly, when Kurdish nationalism started and it spread, they had laid the foundation for it. Kurdish nationalism was, in a sense, it helped by the fact that Iran was occupied by the Allies powers, and northern Kurdistan was occupied by the Red Army of the Soviet Union, and the southern by the British. And nothing happened in the British side, we see, but in the part which was administered at that time by the Russians, or occupied by the Russians, this republic came to existence. However, it should be wrong to say that the Russians actually created this republic. In fact, in my book, as I have referred to the documents of both the British Foreign Office and also some of the documents, political documents of Americans, show that Russians actually had no desire, no plan to create a republic there. In fact, republic was declared against the expressed wishes of the Russian political officer there, which was representing Stalin's Russia in Kurdistan at that time. The Russian plan was that Kurds should unite with Azeris and work under the auspices and the power of the Azeri administration as part of the Azerbaijan Republic, which Kurds did not want that. They basically said in a meeting of the Republican government in Mahabad, they said that, very clearly said that if we want to be under foreign rule, so to speak, in Iran, why should we leave the Persian thing and go to the Azeri one? This is despite the fact that they had very cordial relationship with Azeri Republic. But there is also this matter that has to be clarified. Republic of Kurdistan, or as you call it, Republic of Mahabad, never had a very clear-cut and well-defined political identity. So it was not clear whether it was actually struggling to establish an independent state, or it was really an autonomous plan that wanted administrative, cultural autonomy from the center, but remaining within the domain of Iranian political sovereignty.
But it's quite audacious. I mean, they do build the main building blocks of an independent state. They've got, a government. They've got taxation policy. They've got education policy. They've got sort of infrastructure. How functional was it as an independent state?
Yes, but that is true. I mean, they all created that because they had to run the place. You see, because the Iranian army had collapsed, and the Soviets were there, they were not there, and the Iranian administration had, if you like, no influence there. But yes, they created those structures. But what I'm trying to say is that if you read what are left of their official organ, a newspaper which is called Kurdistan, about 90-odd issues of this have survived today. If you read those and the speeches of the Republican elite, you will see that they're talking about a Kurdish state, not just for Kurds of Iran, but Kurdistan in general, and the greater Kurdistan, so to speak. But also, all the time, they are negotiating with the center. They never stop negotiating with the center about autonomy. And the autonomy discussions, if you like, negotiations, collapsed when the government of Kawam al-Sultanate in Tehran refused to talk to the Kurds, and said that he would only talk to Kurds and Azeris together. And subsequently, when in the same year, and around April of 1946, when Azeris and the central government in Tehran negotiated together over the question of autonomy, only in one clause they are referring to the Kurdish administration in Mahabad, so to speak, or in Kurdish part, Kurdistan. When Qazi Muhammad, who was the head of the Kurdish Republic, returns from Tehran and makes a speech, the speech is very grim, it shows he is disappointed and dismayed with the refusal of the central government to accept the Kurdish demand for autonomy. Similarly, again, after the collapse of the Pahlavi regime in Iran in 1979 and the coming to power of the Islamic Republic, the Kurds raised again the same autonomy demands, and they went to Khomeini, and Khomeini refused. Khomeini's refusal was a restatement, the strong restatement of uniformity of the identity of political power in Iran. And he said, basically, in Islam, we have no ethnicity, no nationalism, we have all brothers, and so on and so forth. But he didn't say that if we are all brothers, why us as brothers
right.
have no voice,
right.
have no language recognized, no ethnicity recognized, no administration, and everything has to be decided for us from the center. Even today, all the administrators in the Kurdish region are chosen and appointed by the central government.
I'm going to ask you about today in a moment, but in that time, when the Republic existed, when it was formed, and that 1 year that it was at its peak, in its existence, I understand that it was a particularly unifying moment for Kurds, right? Because Kurds have somewhat famously, maybe infamously, not necessarily gotten along, depending on their region. The Iranian Kurds, Turkish Kurds, the Kurds of Iraq, but that this Republic of Mahabad was seen at the time as a Republic of Kurdistan for all Kurds. Would that be correct?
No, I mean, you see, if you look at what may be called the political and administrative statements of the Republic, no, it only talks about the Eastern Kurdistan in Iran, and the part of Eastern Kurdistan which is under its administration. But in ideological discourse, of course, you find many references to the idea of Greater Kurdistan and so on, but never it doesn't appear in terms of its political and administrative statements.
I see.
In that,
how did the Republic of Mahabad, Dr. Vali, how did it come to its end in 1946?
By the combination of internal and external factors. Internal factor, most importantly, was that it didn't have that kind of unity within its military and political structure. It relied fundamentally for its military force on the landowning class and on the tribal landlords. And they never really, except for a few of them, they never were sincerely supporters of the Republic. Some of them remained to the very end in contact with the central government and pledged their, if you like, allegiance to central government, despite the fact that they were also in the Republican administration. But the most important thing is that when you are in a society where the economic forces and relations are very weak, and they cannot form a centralizing and structure underneath the political power. Therefore, what becomes prominent is the military power in terms of keeping the unity and the continuity of the political system. But the military power in Kurdistan was largely in the hands of tribal landlords. And when it came to the crunch, they did not fight for the republic. And their head of republic, Qazi Muhammad, knew that. And this was one of the reasons why he refused to fight and surrendered Mahabad and the region under the control of the republic to the central government when the army advanced. Of course, Qazi's decision to give to surrender was also precipitated in certain ways. It was encouraged by the horrendous news that was coming from Azerbaijan and the atrocities that the Iranian army had or were committing in Azerbaijan, murders, destructions, and so on. In fact, Iranian army devastated Azerbaijan. Large number of Azeri political activist members of the Firqe Democrat, they were mostly murdered, mostly in cold blood. And these news spread in Mahabad and others. Ghazi basically decided that he didn't want similar things happening in Kurdistan. But having said that, also the departure of the Soviets and also lack of external support and so on, they were also important factors in the collapse of the republic.
That's an amazing story, this mid-century state that pops up briefly, and it is of such symbolic importance. I want to get to that, but before we end this most interesting chat, which I must thank you for, let me ask you what has happened to Kurdish identity and Kurdish nationalism in the years since 1946, under the Pahlavi government in the Pahlavi era, and then in the Islamic Republic. I'll ask them, take them one at a time. With respect to the years following 1946 and the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, you write, in Pahlavi Iran, nowhere were the defining features of sovereign power played out more vividly and forcefully than in Kurdistan. Can you explain that? What seems to be a statement saying that Kurdistan in particular got it hard after this when it came to the Pahlavi regime?
Well, after the collapse of the Republic, basically dark descent on Kurdistan. Kurdistan was never included in a significant way. For instance, when they brought, just one example, when they brought railroads to Azerbaijan and the railroads stopped in Maraga, they never brought it to Kurdistan. When they were, building new roads and new communication systems, Kurdistan was never part of it. And also, if you look at the statistics, that Kurdistan has been consistently at the bottom of things in terms of the standard of life, in terms of allocation of government resources, in terms of employment, in terms of literacy, and so on and so forth. So it was a deliberate government policy, because Kurdistan was considered as a center of opposition, as a center of nationalist movement challenging the unity of the Persian state, Azeri state. So it was always disfavored. And Kurdistan was effectively run by the military. And throughout this period, when situation like that was in order all the time, therefore the political movement in Kurdistan had to be underground, and it went underground. And after the creation of the infamous SAVAK in a major way attacked Kurdish political organizations and underground political resistance, then Kurdish nationalism in Iran basically moved to Iraqi Kurdistan.
But I would imagine that none of this is to say that what the Iranian Kurds endured under the Pahlavi regime got any better under the Islamic Republic. What has the state of Kurdish identity for the Iranian Kurds and Kurdish nationalism been for the last 40 years?
No, that definitely didn't get better. Definitely the same policy of repression continues. And as I said, because of the definition of the redefinition of political Iranian identity under the Islamic regime and the prominence of Shia religion, now we see that the Sunni activists in Iranian Kurdistan are also suppressed. And if you look at the statistics of, provided by various international organizations and also various human rights organizations in Kurdistan, Iran at large, and the Middle East, and outside in Europe, and so on. If you look at it, the Kurdish population, in terms of political prisoners, in terms of executions, in terms of dying under torture, they are always on top of the list. And now it's not just the ethnic and linguistic nationalists which are imprisoned, but also Sunni political activists, which means that the government has actively politicized Sunnism in Iranian Kurdistan because wants to give prominence to this particular element as against ethnic and linguistic nationalism, which tries to, if you like, weaken them, undermine them. And also the worst economic conditions. Just now, Kurdistan and Baluchistan are at the bottom of the list in terms of any economic indicator that you might imagine.
Dr. Abbas Vali, let me end where we started, perhaps. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the fact that there are many Iranians educated Iranians who don't know about the Republic of Mahabad, the Republic of Kurdistan, as you've also called it, let alone the details of it. That is distinctly in contrast to Kurdish folks who do know about it. And you say that the Republic, this Republic of Mahabad, for Kurds is not something that took place in the past, but is also one that is living with them in the present. What does a short-lived republic from 75 years ago still mean to the Kurdish people across the region today?
Because it is a powerful landmark in Kurdish national memory. And it is always lived and relived in the national memory. And then, everything which happens, that in not only just in the Kurdish region in Iran, but also other parts of Kurdistan. So anything that is traumatizing this national memory is also invoking the history and the fate of Republic. It is one of the most important events in modern Kurdish history, and clearly one of the most important factors in the formation of the nationalist discourse, and also in the construction and reconstruction of this national memory. It is always there, and it's always alive, and it always animates discourse, it always animates practice.
I have to say, in preparation for this interview and researching the Republic of Mahabad, I only found out yesterday, as I was putting together the introduction of you, that you were born in Mahabad, and you were born just 3 years after the Republic came to its end. Just out of curiosity, when you were growing up as a kid there, what did you hear about the Republic of Mahabad? Were you aware of it, and how did you see it in your mind's eye?
Well, we lived in a kind of a double world. At home, we spoke about it, we revered it, we referred to it, we sung and read poetry about it. But outside home, it was total silence. We could not. This duality, I think, is marks the memory and the consciousness of any Kurd in Iran. I went to school in Azerbaijan, so that means in Tabriz, which is central city of eastern Azerbaijan.
Yes.
And I, as a kid, I for first time encountered the Persian language in a school. Before that, I never knew a word of it. And therefore, starting an education for a kid who speaks Kurdish at home, Azeri in in the town, and then starting an education in Persian, a language who he doesn't know at all, is is very traumatic. That's why for all those let's say citizens of Iran, or all those people who live in Iran, and Persian is not their mother tongue, they have experienced this trauma, and this trauma has scarred their consciousness and their outlook. And this is not something that just I have experienced, but every other kid in the Kurdish society has experienced. When we were talking about Republic, or even talking about the movement, we were talking about arrests, about people fleeing the country to Iraq or to Istanbul and so on. They were all talks that had to be done in secret, because outside you couldn't talk about it. You had to police yourself. You had to observe this rule that this is a forbidden area. And that always reminds us that our identity is part of this forbidden world. Our identity is an identity that has to be concealed, has to be hidden to protect us. It was a forbidden, suppressed, and denied identity. That's why this memory lives in Kurds, memory of Republic, and everything to do with resistance, everything to do with this, Kurdishness, expression of Kurdishness is so powerful.
Dr. Abbas Vali, it's been a pleasure and an education, and I thank you so much for all the time you put in today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I also thank your audience who would be listening and hearing me, and I'm looking forward to seeing their comments.
Absolutely. They will be shared with you. Merci. Khodafis.
Khodafis.
Dr. Abbas Vali, an author and Kurdish political and social theorist specializing in modern and contemporary political thought and modern Middle Eastern politics. His forthcoming book is called Reconstituting the Kurdish Question, Power and Resistance in Contemporary Kurdistan. Dr. Abbas Vali joined me from Istanbul, Turkey today. This is Full Time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 13. Brought to you with the support of Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC. On Instagram, please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That's our website, roqemedia.com. Thanks to the team who make Roqe Media happen: Susan, Anahita, Parisa, Panta, Kian, Roham, Mehrdad, Reza, and Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.